The story of Atlantis does not begin where most people imagine. It does not start beneath the waves, in sunken ruins waiting to be discovered by divers or submarines. It does not emerge from archaeological digs in distant deserts or from encrypted manuscripts hidden in forgotten libraries. The story of Atlantis begins in a place far more unexpected, in the mind of a philosopher walking through the marble colonnades of ancient Athens, in the year 360 BC, contemplating the nature of the ideal state and the fragility of human virtue. Plato, already in his 70s, had witnessed the rise and catastrophic fall of Athenian democracy. He had seen his beloved city transformed from the defender of Greek freedom into an aggressive imperial power, drunk on its own success, blind to its moral decay. He had watched as the Peloponnesian War tore the Greek world apart, leaving Athens humiliated and broken. And in those twilight years of his life, he decided to craft a story, a warning, perhaps, or a meditation, about what happens when great civilizations lose their way. The story appeared in two of Plato's dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. These were not histories in the modern sense, not journalism or archaeology. They were philosophical constructs, written in the distinctive style of Socratic dialogue, where ideas were explored through conversation between characters. And yet, for more than 2,000 years, readers have wondered, was there something real beneath the allegory? Did Plato preserve a genuine memory of an ancient catastrophe? Or did he simply invent the most enduring mystery in human history? The dialogues present the story through the voice of Critias, a character based on Plato's own great-grandfather, who claims to have inherited the tale through a remarkable chain of oral transmission. According to Critias, the story originated with Solon, the legendary Athenian lawgiver who had traveled to Egypt around 590 BC. There, in the city of Sais, Egyptian priests revealed to him the ancient records of a great civilization that had existed 9,000 years before their time. A civilization that had once threatened the known world before vanishing beneath the ocean in a single catastrophic day and night. The priests, Critias explains, were keepers of temple archives that supposedly contained records spanning millennia, far beyond anything preserved in Greek memory. This detail is crucial to understanding Plato's narrative strategy. By placing the source of his story in Egypt, a civilization that Greeks viewed as unimaginably ancient and wise, he gave his account an air of authenticity that purely Greek sources could never provide. Egypt represented continuity with the deep past, a bridge to epics that predated the Trojan War, predated the great floods and migrations that had erased so much of human memory. The Timaeus serves primarily as an introduction, positioning the Atlantis story as a prelude to Plato's broader discussion of the cosmos and the ideal state. Here, Critias briefly outlines the basic premise. Ancient Athens had once stood as the epitome of the perfect state, successfully defending the Mediterranean world against the aggressive expansion of Atlantis. This preliminary account establishes the fundamental conflict at the heart of the narrative, between the virtuous, well-ordered Athenian state and the corrupt, imperialistic Atlantean empire. But it is in the Critias dialogue, though incomplete, that Plato provides the detailed description that has captivated imaginations for over 2 millennia. And the detail is extraordinary. Plato does not sketch vague outlines or rely on poetic suggestion. He provides measurements, population figures, architectural specifications, and political structures with a precision that seems almost obsessive. This detail has been both the story's greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. Strength because it makes the narrative feel tangible and real, vulnerability because it invites empirical investigation that has consistently failed to find supporting evidence. Atlantis, according to Plato, was an island larger than Libya and Asia combined, situated beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar. This geographical placement was significant. It positioned Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean, in waters that were supposedly impassable after the island's destruction, due to shallow mud left by the catastrophe. This convenient detail explained why no contemporary Greek explorers had rediscovered the lost continent, while simultaneously placing it just beyond the edge of the known world, in that liminal space where extraordinary things might plausibly exist. The physical description of Atlantis reveals a civilization of extraordinary sophistication and wealth. The island consisted of alternating rings of land and water, with the central island measuring approximately 50 stadia in diameter, roughly 5.7 miles. These concentric circles were connected by tunnels large enough for ships to pass through, creating a complex system of harbors and waterways. The outermost ring of water served as a massive harbor capable of accommodating vast fleets of triremes and merchant vessels. The capital city's architecture reflected both military pragmatism and ostentatious display of wealth. Massive walls surrounded each ring, with the outer wall covered in brass, the middle wall coated in tin, and the innermost wall gleaming with orichalcum, a mysterious metal that Plato describes as second in value only to gold. These metallic surfaces would have created a dazzling spectacle, reflecting sunlight across the harbor and visible from great distances at sea. Imagine approaching this city as a foreign merchant or ambassador. The blinding flash of golden light, the impossible geometry of concentric circles, the sheer scale of the engineering. It would have seemed like a vision from another world. At the heart of the city stood the royal palace and the temple of Poseidon, the patron deity of Atlantis. This temple, measuring 600 feet in length, 300 feet in width, and proportionally tall, was constructed entirely of silver except for its golden pinnacles. Inside, a colossal gold statue of Poseidon driving 6-winged horses dominated the interior, reaching nearly to the ceiling. The temple grounds contained golden statues of the 10 original Atlantean kings and their wives, creating a pantheon of dynastic power frozen in precious metal. The Atlantean society that Plato describes operated under a unique governmental system combining elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and federalism. 10 kings, all descendants of Atlas, the firstborn son of Poseidon, ruled different regions of the island and its external territories. These rulers gathered every 5th and 6th year, alternately, in the temple of Poseidon to deliberate on matters of common interest and to judge any infractions of their sacred laws, which were inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum within the temple. The military capabilities of Atlantis reflected its vast resources and population. Plato provides specific numbers that are both impressive and troubling in their precision. The island could field 60,000 leaders of soldiers, 120,000 hoplites, 180,000 archers, 180,000 slingers, 300,000 stone shooters and javelin men, 240,000 horsemen, and 60,000 chariots. The naval forces included 1,200 ships, each carrying 200 men. These figures suggest a total military force exceeding 1 million men, supported by a civilian population that must have numbered in the tens of millions. The economic foundation of this military machine rested on the island's extraordinary natural abundance. The fertile plains produced 2 harvests annually, watered by winter rains and summer irrigation from an elaborate canal system. The main canal, 300 feet wide, 100 feet deep, and 1,125 miles long, connected the capital to the sea, while smaller channels created a grid pattern across the rectangular plain, facilitating both irrigation and transportation. This agricultural productivity supported not only the massive population but also extensive trade networks that brought exotic goods from across the known world. The technological achievements of Atlantis extended beyond agriculture and architecture. Plato describes sophisticated engineering projects including the excavation of harbors, the construction of bridges spanning the water rings, and the creation of underground passages for ships. The Atlanteans possessed advanced metallurgy, working not only with conventional metals but also with the mysterious orichalcum, which they mined from the earth in many parts of the island. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity and power, Plato weaves a narrative of moral decline that serves as the philosophical core of his account. Initially, the Atlanteans embodied virtue and wisdom, their divine heritage from Poseidon manifested in just governance and noble character. However, as generations passed and the divine element in their nature became diluted through intermarriage with mortals, their character gradually deteriorated. They became consumed with material wealth, political ambition, and imperial expansion. This transformation from virtue to corruption represents the central allegorical message of Plato's narrative. The early Atlanteans, like the ideal citizens of Plato's Republic, possessed the cardinal virtues of wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. Their society functioned harmoniously because each individual fulfilled their proper role according to their nature and abilities. The later Atlanteans, by contrast, exemplified the dangers of unchecked democracy and material excess that Plato observed in contemporary Athens. The timeline Plato establishes places the Atlantis story approximately 9,600 years before his own era, around 9,500 BC. This dating positions the narrative in the immediate aftermath of the last ice age, a period when sea levels were indeed rising and coastal civilizations might have faced catastrophic flooding. However, the 9,000-year gap also conveniently places the events beyond the reach of any contemporary historical verification, lending the account an air of ancient authenticity while preventing factual challenges. The geographical location beyond the Pillars of Hercules similarly serves multiple narrative purposes. This placement removes Atlantis from the familiar Mediterranean world while positioning it as a genuine threat to the civilizations Plato's audience knew. The Atlantic Ocean represented the edge of the known world, a realm of mystery where extraordinary civilizations might plausibly have existed. The subsequent impassability of these waters due to mud shallows provided a convenient explanation for why no contemporary explorers had rediscovered the lost continent. The question of Plato's intent in creating the Atlantis narrative has generated scholarly debate for centuries. Several factors suggest that Plato conceived Atlantis primarily as a philosophical allegory rather than historical fact. The account appears exclusively in Plato's works, with no corroborating evidence from other ancient sources who would have had access to the same Egyptian records. The detailed numerical specifications, from military forces to architectural dimensions, display the systematic precision characteristic of Plato's theoretical constructions rather than the approximate estimates typical of historical accounts. Furthermore, the Atlantis story serves specific philosophical and political purposes within the broader context of Plato's work. The contrast between virtuous ancient Athens and corrupt Atlantis mirrors the distinction between the ideal state described in the Republic and the degenerate democracies Plato criticized in contemporary Greece. The pedagogical function of the Atlantis narrative also supports its allegorical interpretation. The tale of Atlantis provides a vivid example of how material prosperity and military power, divorced from virtue and wisdom, inevitably lead to moral corruption and ultimate destruction. This lesson carried particular relevance for Plato's contemporaries, who had witnessed Athens's transformation from the defender of Greek freedom against Persian invasion to an aggressive imperial power whose overreach had led to defeat in the Peloponnesian War. The specific details of Atlantean society often mirror and critique aspects of Athenian civilization during its imperial period. The extensive naval forces, the tribute-paying subject territories, the magnificent public buildings funded by imperial wealth, and the gradual erosion of traditional values, all reflected patterns that Plato's audience would have recognized from their own recent history. The catastrophic end of Atlantis served as a warning about the potential consequences of imperial hubris and moral decline. Yet the possibility remains that Plato drew inspiration from actual historical events or civilizations, even while crafting a primarily allegorical narrative. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC had witnessed the sudden disappearance of several advanced civilizations, including the Mycenaean Greeks and the Hittite Empire. Memories of these catastrophes might have survived in oral traditions, providing a historical foundation for Plato's fictional elaboration. The immediate aftermath of Plato's death in 347 BC marked the beginning of a complex intellectual legacy regarding his Atlantis narrative. None proved more influential in shaping subsequent interpretations than Aristotle, whose categorical dismissal of Atlantis as historical fact would echo through centuries of scholarly discourse. His famous declaration, that the man who dreamed it up made it vanish, represented more than casual skepticism. It reflected a fundamental disagreement about the proper relationship between philosophical instruction and factual accuracy. The Atlantis narrative, with its precise numerical details and elaborate geographical descriptions, presented exactly the kind of fictional framework disguised as historical fact that Aristotle found methodologically problematic. Other immediate disciples of Plato adopted more nuanced positions. Crantor of Soli, who studied directly under Xenocrates in the early 3rd century BC, represented the first known attempt to defend the historical authenticity of the Atlantis account. His commentary on the Timaeus, fragments of which survive in later Neoplatonic sources, argued that Plato had indeed based his narrative on genuine Egyptian records. Crantor claimed to have verified the existence of these records during his own travels, though the specific nature of his evidence remains unclear from surviving fragments. The absence of Atlantis references in contemporary historical works presents one of the most compelling arguments for Aristotle's position. Herodotus, writing his histories in the mid-5th century BC, demonstrated exhaustive curiosity about distant lands and ancient civilizations. His accounts encompass regions from Scythia to Ethiopia, incorporating local traditions, religious practices, and historical memories spanning centuries. Yet nowhere in his comprehensive survey of the Mediterranean world and its periphery does Herodotus mention any tradition resembling the Atlantis story, despite his documented fascination with Egyptian wisdom and historical records. Similarly, Thucydides, whose history of the Peloponnesian War established new standards for historical accuracy and source criticism, makes no reference to any ancient Athenian victory over a Western maritime empire. Given Thucydides' meticulous attention to Athenian historical traditions and his pride in documenting the city's past achievements, this omission carries particular weight. His account of early Greek history, though brief, includes references to various ancient conflicts and migrations that would have provided natural context for mentioning the Atlantis War, if such traditions had existed. The geographic writings of Strabo, composed during the early Roman Empire, provide perhaps the most systematic ancient critique of the Atlantis narrative. Writing around the time of Augustus, Strabo possessed access to extensive geographical literature from the Hellenistic period, including works by explorers who had ventured beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic Ocean. His dismissal of Atlantis as Plato's invention carried the weight of comprehensive geographical knowledge unavailable to earlier critics. Strabo's analysis focused particularly on the practical impossibilities of Plato's geographical claims. The assertion that Atlantis had been larger than Libya and Asia combined struck him as fundamentally incompatible with what Hellenistic explorers had discovered about the Atlantic Ocean's extent and character. Furthermore, Strabo noted that Plato's claim about impassable mudshallows preventing later exploration contradicted the experiences of contemporary navigators who had successfully sailed Atlantic waters. The Roman historical tradition similarly ignored the Atlantis narrative, despite extensive engagement with Greek philosophical and historical sources. Livy's monumental Ob Urbe Condita incorporated numerous Greek historical traditions and legends, yet makes no reference to Atlantis despite covering periods when such a story might have provided useful comparative material. Tacitus, renowned for his critical approach to sources and his interest in the relationship between geography and political power, likewise omits any mention of the lost civilization, despite his detailed discussions of distant lands and peoples. This pattern of omission becomes particularly significant when contrasted with the Roman treatment of other Platonic ideas. Roman intellectuals readily adopted and adapted Plato's political theories, educational philosophies, and metaphysical concepts. Yet the Atlantis narrative failed to gain traction in Roman historical or geographical literature, suggesting that educated Romans recognized its fictional character even when they embraced other aspects of Platonic thought. The rise of Neoplatonism during late antiquity marked a dramatic shift in the reception of the Atlantis narrative. Beginning with Plotinus in the 3rd century AD and reaching full development under Proclus in the 5th century, Neoplatonic philosophers approached Plato's works with a fundamentally different interpretive framework than their classical predecessors. Rather than viewing the dialogues primarily as philosophical arguments or historical accounts, they understood them as complex allegorical systems encoding profound metaphysical truths. Proclus, writing his extensive commentary on the Timaeus around 440 AD, devoted considerable attention to defending both the historical accuracy and allegorical significance of the Atlantis account. His approach reflected the Neoplatonic conviction that Plato's writings operated simultaneously on multiple levels of meaning. According to Proclus, the surface narrative of Atlantis described actual historical events, while the deeper allegorical structure revealed truths about the cosmic order and the soul's relationship to material existence. The Neoplatonic defense of Atlantis's historicity rested partly on theological arguments about divine providence and partly on elaborate theories about the relationship between time and eternity. Proclus argued that the Egyptian priests mentioned by Plato possessed genuine access to ancient records because their religious traditions maintained unbroken continuity with primordial wisdom. This continuity, guaranteed by divine providence, ensured the preservation of historical truth across millennia, despite the general tendency toward cultural decline and forgetfulness. More significantly, Proclus developed sophisticated allegorical interpretations that transformed the Atlantis narrative into a cosmic drama. In his reading, the conflict between Athens and Atlantis represented the eternal struggle between intellectual and material principles within both the cosmos and the individual soul. Ancient Athens embodied the philosophical life oriented toward eternal truths, while Atlantis symbolized the material world's seductive power and ultimate instability. The destruction of Atlantis thus illustrated the inevitable fate of any civilization that prioritized material prosperity over spiritual wisdom. These allegorical interpretations allowed Neoplatonic philosophers to embrace the Atlantis narrative without confronting the historical and geographical difficulties that had troubled earlier critics. By locating the story's primary significance in its symbolic rather than literal content, they could simultaneously affirm its truth and acknowledge its apparent incompatibility with known historical facts. This interpretive strategy proved influential among later medieval and Renaissance readers who inherited Neoplatonic approaches to Platonic texts. The encounter between the Atlantis narrative and early Christian thought produced complex and varied responses that reflected broader tensions between classical learning and biblical authority. Early Christian writers faced the challenge of integrating Greek philosophical wisdom with revealed truth while maintaining the primacy of scriptural chronology and historical framework. The Atlantis story presented particular difficulties because its ancient dating appeared to conflict with biblical accounts of human history and divine providence. Clement of Alexandria, writing around 200 AD, demonstrated the sophisticated approach that characterized Alexandrian Christian scholarship. Rather than rejecting the Atlantis narrative outright, Clement sought to harmonize it with Christian historical understanding through careful chronological analysis. He argued that the Egyptian dating systems underlying Plato's account suffered from systematic errors that made ancient events appear far more remote than they actually were. By adjusting these chronologies to align with biblical timelines, Clement suggested that the Atlantis story might refer to events occurring within the framework of sacred history. Augustine of Hippo adopted a more skeptical stance that reflected his broader concerns about the relationship between classical learning and Christian faith. In The City of God, Augustine acknowledged the philosophical value of Platonic thought while maintaining critical distance from specific historical claims that lacked scriptural support. His treatment of Atlantis exemplified this balanced approach, recognizing the story's allegorical potential while expressing doubt about its literal accuracy. The chronological problems posed by the Atlantis narrative became increasingly acute as Christian scholars developed more systematic approaches to universal history. The traditional dating of Atlantis to approximately 9,500 BC created obvious conflicts with biblical chronologies that placed human creation only a few millennia before the Christian era. Some Christian writers attempted to resolve this difficulty by arguing that Plato had misunderstood the Egyptian chronological systems, while others suggested that the story referred to antediluvian civilizations mentioned obliquely in Genesis. Eastern Christian writers, particularly those working within the Byzantine tradition, often proved more receptive to the Atlantis narrative than their Western counterparts. The Byzantine scholarly tradition maintained closer continuity with classical Greek learning and showed greater willingness to integrate non-biblical historical traditions into comprehensive historical frameworks. The patristic treatment of Atlantis also reflected broader theological concerns about divine justice and the fate of civilizations. Many Christian writers found in the destruction of Atlantis a powerful illustration of divine judgment against human pride and corruption. This theological interpretation allowed them to embrace the story's moral message while remaining agnostic about its historical accuracy. The narrative's emphasis on the gradual moral decline of initially virtuous people resonated strongly with Christian understandings of human nature and the consequences of sin. The preservation and transmission of classical texts during the early medieval period significantly influenced later reception of the Atlantis narrative. As European scholars gradually recovered access to complete versions of Plato's dialogues, they encountered the story within its original philosophical context rather than through the filtered interpretations of earlier commentators. The collapse of classical learning institutions across Western Europe during the 5th and 6th centuries created an intellectual vacuum that profoundly affected the transmission of Platonic texts. As barbarian invasions disrupted trade networks and urban centers, the elaborate manuscript copying operations that had sustained classical literature for centuries began to disintegrate. Monastic scriptoria, while preserving essential Christian texts, operated with severely limited resources and necessarily selective copying priorities. In this environment of intellectual triage, the complete works of Plato, including the dialogues containing the Atlantis narrative, effectively vanished from Western European libraries. The Carolingian Renaissance of the 8th and 9th centuries, despite its significant achievements in preserving and copying classical texts, failed to recover the complete Platonic corpus. Charlemagne's scholars, working primarily from Latin sources, had access to only limited portions of Plato's work through intermediary sources. The Timaeus existed in partial Latin translation through Chalcidius's 4th century version, But this translation ended abruptly at the point where Plato begins his detailed description of Atlantis, leaving medieval readers without access to the complete narrative. This textual gap created a peculiar situation where educated Europeans possessed theoretical knowledge about Plato's philosophical importance while remaining largely ignorant of his specific teachings. The Atlantis narrative, requiring access to the complete Timaeus and Critias dialogues, remained effectively unknown to medieval scholarship. The few references to lost civilizations that appeared in medieval literature typically derived from biblical or patristic sources rather than classical Greek philosophy. Medieval chroniclers showed considerable interest in antediluvian history and the fate of pre-Christian civilizations, but their investigations drew primarily from Genesis, the Book of Enoch, and early Christian historical works. When medieval writers speculated about ancient catastrophes or vanished peoples, they framed their discussions within biblical chronology and theological interpretation rather than Platonic philosophy. The scholastic movement of the 12th and 13th centuries, despite its sophisticated engagement with classical philosophical texts, continued to lack access to the complete Platonic corpus. Thomas Aquinas, whose Summa Theologica demonstrated remarkable familiarity with Aristotelian philosophy, made only passing references to Platonic ideas and showed no knowledge of the Atlantis narrative. The translation movement centered in medieval Spain, which brought numerous Arabic philosophical texts into Latin, also failed to recover the missing Platonic dialogues. Islamic scholars had preserved extensive Aristotelian materials, but their libraries apparently lacked complete versions of the Timaeus and Critias. The absence of Atlantis references in medieval literature becomes particularly striking when contrasted with the period's fascination with geographical speculation and legendary lands. Medieval writers displayed intense curiosity about distant regions, mythical islands, and lost civilizations, producing elaborate accounts of places like the earthly paradise, the kingdom of Prester John, and various Atlantic islands reported by sailors. The intellectual appetite clearly existed for narratives like the Atlantis story, yet the specific Platonic account remained unavailable to satisfy this curiosity. The Renaissance transformation of European intellectual culture began with the gradual recovery of classical Greek texts through contact with Byzantine scholars. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 accelerated this process by forcing Greek scholars westward, carrying with them manuscript collections that had survived in Eastern libraries. Among these recovered texts were complete versions of Plato's dialogues, including the Timaeus and Critias that contain the full Atlantis narrative. Marsilio Ficino's monumental Latin translation of Plato's complete works, completed in Florence around 1484, marked the decisive moment in the Atlantis narrative's return to European consciousness. Ficino, working under the patronage of Cosimo de' Medici, approached his translation project with both scholarly rigor and philosophical enthusiasm that reflected the broader Renaissance engagement with classical antiquity. His translation made Platonic texts accessible to educated Europeans for the first time in nearly a millennium, creating the foundation for renewed scholarly engagement with the Atlantis story. Ficino's interpretive approach to the Atlantis narrative reflected his deep commitment to Neoplatonic philosophy and his belief in the fundamental compatibility between Platonic wisdom and Christian truth. Rather than viewing the story as either pure fiction or literal history, Ficino understood it as a complex allegorical framework that encoded profound truths about human nature and divine providence. His commentary emphasized the moral dimensions of the narrative, interpreting the rise and fall of Atlantis as an illustration of the eternal conflict between spiritual and material values. The Medici court's intellectual environment proved particularly receptive to the Atlantis narrative's themes of lost wisdom and ancient greatness. Renaissance humanists, acutely conscious of their own civilization's relationship to classical antiquity, found in the Atlantis story a powerful metaphor for the recovery and loss of cultural achievement. Pico della Mirandola's engagement with the Atlantis narrative exemplified the Renaissance synthesis of classical philosophy, Christian theology, and esoteric wisdom traditions. His oration on the dignity of man reflected the same confidence in human potential that characterized Plato's description of early Atlantean civilization, while his warnings about the dangers of material excess echoed the moral decline that Plato attributed to later Atlantean generations. The printing revolution of the late 15th century dramatically expanded access to Ficino's Platonic translations, ensuring that the Atlantis narrative reached scholarly audiences throughout Europe. The 1491 Venetian edition of Ficino's translation, produced by Aldus Manutius, exemplified the new technology's capacity to disseminate classical texts with unprecedented speed and accuracy. Within decades, educated Europeans from London to Prague possessed access to complete versions of the Timaeus and Critias, ending the millennium-long absence of the Atlantis story from European intellectual discourse. The rediscovery of the Atlantis narrative coincided with the Age of Exploration's dramatic expansion of geographical knowledge, creating unprecedented opportunities for new interpretations of Plato's account. Columbus's voyages across the Atlantic Ocean, beginning in 1492, occurred within a decade of Ficino's translation project, establishing a remarkable chronological convergence between textual recovery and geographical exploration. This timing proved crucial for subsequent interpretations of the Atlantis narrative, as European scholars suddenly possessed both access to Plato's complete account and contemporary evidence of previously unknown lands beyond the Atlantic. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire provided particularly compelling material for Atlantis speculation. Hernán Cortés's letters describing Tenochtitlan's sophisticated urban planning, elaborate water management systems, and vast wealth immediately reminded educated Europeans of Plato's description of the Atlantean capital. The city's location on an island connected to the mainland by causeways, its complex system of canals and harbors, and its impressive architectural achievements all seem to echo specific details from the Critias dialogue. Francisco López de Gamara's Historia General de las Indias, published in 1552, made explicit connections between the newly discovered American civilizations and Plato's Atlantis narrative. López de Gamara argued that the advanced indigenous cultures encountered by Spanish conquistadors provided concrete evidence that sophisticated civilizations had indeed existed in the Atlantic region. The geographical location of the Americas relative to the Mediterranean world also seemed to support Platonic accuracy. The positioning of the New World beyond the Strait of Gibraltar corresponded precisely to Plato's description of Atlantis as lying beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The vast size of the American continents matched Plato's claim that Atlantis had been larger than Libya and Asia combined. Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo's Historia General y Natural de las Indias offered a more systematic analysis of parallels between Platonic descriptions and American realities. The discovery of advanced hydraulic engineering in various American cultures provided particularly striking parallels to Plato's description of Atlantean water management. The elaborate canal systems of the Aztec capital, the sophisticated irrigation networks of Andean civilizations, and the complex harbor facilities found at various coastal sites all demonstrated engineering capabilities that matched or exceeded those attributed to Atlantis. These technological parallels suggested to Renaissance observers that American civilizations possessed the advanced knowledge that would have been necessary to construct the elaborate infrastructure described in the Critias. José de Acosta's Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias, published in 1590, attempted to provide a comprehensive framework for understanding the relationship between classical accounts of lost civilizations and contemporary American discoveries. Acosta argued that the Americas had been populated by successive waves of migration from the Old World, some of which might have carried memories of ancient civilizations that ultimately influenced indigenous American cultures. This migration theory provided a mechanism for explaining apparent parallels between Platonic descriptions and American realities without requiring direct historical continuity. The chronological difficulties posed by Plato's dating of Atlantis to approximately 9,500 BC created significant challenges for scholars attempting to connect the narrative with known American civilizations. Renaissance chronographers, working within biblical frameworks that placed human creation only a few millennia before the Christian era, struggled to accommodate Plato's ancient dating while maintaining the historical accuracy of scriptural accounts. Some scholars resolved this difficulty by arguing that Plato had misunderstood Egyptian chronological systems, while others suggested that the story referred to more recent events that had been artificially antiquated through oral transmission. The linguistic evidence presented by American discoveries also influenced Renaissance interpretations of the Atlantis narrative. Early ethnographers noted apparent similarities between certain American languages and Old World linguistic families, suggesting possible historical connections that might support Platonic claims about ancient Atlantic civilizations. While these linguistic parallels later proved largely illusory, they provided contemporary scholars with additional evidence for treating the Atlantis narrative as historically grounded rather than purely fictional. The intellectual ferment of the 17th and 18th centuries transformed European approaches to ancient texts and historical claims with unprecedented rigor. The scientific revolution's emphasis on empirical observation and systematic methodology created new frameworks for evaluating historical narratives. The Swedish scholar Olaus Rudbeck emerged as perhaps the most ambitious and systematic proponent of Atlantis theories during this period. His monumental work Atland eller Mannheim, published in 4 volumes between 1679 and 1702, represented an extraordinary attempt to relocate Plato's lost civilization within the familiar geography of Scandinavia. Rudbeck, who held the chair of medicine at Uppsala University and possessed extensive knowledge of Nordic archaeology and linguistics, developed an elaborate theory identifying Sweden as the original Atlantis described by Plato. Rudbeck's identification of Sweden with Atlantis rested on a complex philological argument that traced the name Atlantis through various linguistic transformations to Atland, which he interpreted as an ancient designation for Swedish territory. He argued that classical authors had systematically misunderstood the geographical references in ancient sources, placing Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean when the original accounts actually referred to the Baltic Sea region. According to Rudbeck's reconstruction, the Pillars of Hercules mentioned by Plato did not refer to the Strait of Gibraltar but rather to some northern geographical feature, possibly the narrow passages between Danish islands or the entrance to the Baltic Sea itself. The archaeological evidence that Rudbeck marshaled in support of his theory reflected the limited but growing knowledge of Scandinavian prehistory available in the late 17th century. He pointed to the numerous Bronze Age burial mounds scattered across the Swedish landscape as evidence of an ancient civilization of extraordinary sophistication and wealth. The elaborate grave goods discovered in these burials, including intricate metalwork and imported materials from distant regions, suggested to Rudbeck a level of cultural development and international trade connections that matched Plato's descriptions of Atlantean prosperity and influence. Rudbeck's linguistic analysis extended beyond simple etymological connections to encompass a comprehensive theory about the relationship between ancient Swedish and classical languages. He argued that many fundamental terms in Greek and Latin actually derived from Proto-Germanic roots preserved in Swedish, suggesting that Scandinavian civilization had provided the foundation for classical Mediterranean cultures rather than the reverse. This linguistic priority, according to Rudbeck, explained how ancient Swedish traditions about their own glorious past had eventually reached Egyptian priests and ultimately influenced Plato's account. The geographical features of Sweden and its surrounding regions provided Rudbeck with numerous parallels to Plato's description of Atlantis. The complex archipelago systems along Sweden's eastern coast, with their intricate patterns of islands, straits, and sheltered harbors, seem to echo the concentric rings of land and water that Plato attributed to the Atlantean capital. The extensive lake systems of central Sweden, connected by rivers and navigable waterways, offered a plausible model for the elaborate canal networks that Plato described as facilitating both transportation and irrigation throughout Atlantean territory. Rudbeck's reconstruction of ancient Swedish climate and geography relied heavily on his understanding of post-glacial geological processes, which represented cutting-edge scientific knowledge for his era. He argued that the Baltic Sea region had undergone dramatic changes since ancient times, with land elevation and sea level fluctuations transforming the geographical relationships between land and water. These changes, according to Rudbeck, explained why contemporary Scandinavia no longer matched Plato's descriptions exactly, while preserving enough similarities to reveal the underlying correspondence. The political implications of Rudbeck's theory extended far beyond academic scholarship, to encompass questions of national identity and cultural prestige that resonated powerfully in 17th-century Sweden. The Swedish Empire under Charles XI had reached unprecedented territorial extent, controlling much of the Baltic region and asserting influence throughout northern Europe. Rudbeck's identification of Sweden as the original Atlantis provided historical justification for Swedish political dominance, while establishing the cultural superiority of Nordic civilization over classical Mediterranean traditions. Contemporary critics of Rudbeck's theory focused primarily on his philological methods rather than challenging his archaeological evidence directly. The German scholar Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, despite his general admiration for Rudbeck's erudition, expressed skepticism about the linguistic connections that formed the foundation of the Swedish scholar's argument. Leibniz noted that similar etymological methods could be used to connect virtually any modern language with ancient terms, making such arguments inherently unreliable without independent corroborating evidence. The broader intellectual context of late 17th-century scholarship provided both support and challenges for Rudbeck's approach to ancient texts. The emerging discipline of comparative linguistics had begun to reveal genuine historical relationships between different language families, lending credibility to arguments based on philological analysis. However, the systematic methods that would later characterize historical linguistics remained undeveloped, allowing scholars considerable latitude in proposing etymological connections that later investigation would prove unfounded. French scholars of the early 18th century developed alternative approaches to the Atlantis narrative that reflected their nation's growing involvement in global exploration and colonial expansion. The mathematician and geographer Philippe Boich proposed in 1737 that Atlantis had been located in the North Atlantic region, possibly corresponding to submerged land masses between Europe and North America. This theory drew on emerging oceanographic knowledge and geological speculation about past changes in sea level, representing an early attempt to apply scientific reasoning to the geographical aspects of Plato's account. Boich's cartographic work provided visual representation of his theories through detailed maps showing hypothetical Atlantic land masses that might have existed in ancient times. His carte physique et politique de l'Atlantique depicted a series of islands and shallow areas that could plausibly have supported the large population and extensive territories that Plato attributed to Atlantis. The map incorporated contemporary knowledge about ocean depths and underwater topography, while extrapolating possible ancient configurations based on geological theories about crustal movement and sea level change. The influence of emerging geological knowledge on Atlantis theories became increasingly significant throughout the 18th century as scholars developed more sophisticated understanding of Earth's physical processes. The recognition that sea levels had changed dramatically over geological time provided a plausible mechanism for explaining how large land masses might have disappeared beneath ocean waters. The discovery of marine fossils in mountain regions demonstrated that current geographical relationships between land and sea differed significantly from past configurations, lending credibility to claims about vanished continents. Voltaire's treatment of the Atlantis narrative in his essay Sur les Moors exemplified the Enlightenment's critical approach to ancient authorities and historical claims. Rather than accepting Plato's account at face value or attempting to identify specific geographical locations for Atlantis, Voltaire subjected the narrative to systematic rational analysis that revealed numerous internal inconsistencies and implausibilities. His critique focused particularly on the chronological problems posed by Plato's dating and the absence of corroborating evidence from other ancient sources. The methodological innovations of 18th-century historiography provided new tools for evaluating ancient texts that fundamentally changed scholarly approaches to narratives like Atlantis. Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire demonstrated how careful source criticism and systematic comparison of different accounts could reveal the historical accuracy or inaccuracy of ancient claims. The expansion of European knowledge about Pacific Ocean geography through the voyages of James Cook and other explorers provided fresh contexts for interpreting ancient accounts of distant lands. The discovery of sophisticated Polynesian civilizations scattered across vast oceanic distances demonstrated that advanced cultures could indeed exist on remote islands, lending some credibility to claims about ancient Atlantic civilizations. However, the absence of any archaeological evidence for large-scale civilization in the Atlantic region contrasted sharply with the abundant material remains of Pacific island cultures. German scholars of the mid-18th century developed increasingly sophisticated approaches to ancient mythology and historical narratives that influenced interpretations of the Atlantis story. Johann David Michaelis's work on biblical chronology and ancient Near Eastern history provided methodological frameworks for evaluating claims about ancient civilizations and their historical relationships. His emphasis on linguistic evidence and comparative cultural analysis offered alternatives to the purely geographical approaches that had dominated earlier Atlantis speculation. The emergence of systematic archaeology during the later 18th century began to provide concrete evidence about ancient civilizations that could be compared with Plato's descriptions of Atlantis. The excavation of Pompeii and Herculaneum revealed the material culture of ancient urban civilizations with unprecedented detail, allowing scholars to evaluate the plausibility of Plato's claims about Atlantean technology and social organization. The philosophical implications of Atlantis theories also received increased attention during the Enlightenment, as scholars grappled with questions about the relationship between historical truth and moral instruction. David Hume's analysis of testimony and evidence in his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding provided frameworks for evaluating extraordinary historical claims that could be applied to narratives like Atlantis. His emphasis on the inherent improbability of miraculous or extraordinary events challenged scholars to provide exceptional evidence for exceptional claims about ancient civilizations. The publication of Atlantis, The Antediluvian World in 1882, marked a seismic shift in how the Western world understood and interpreted Plato's ancient narrative. Ignatius Donnelly, a charismatic former congressman from Minnesota with no formal training in archaeology or ancient history, produced a work that would fundamentally reshape popular conceptions of human prehistory and establish enduring mythologies about lost civilizations that persist to this day. His 500-page tome, dense with citations, maps, and comparative analyses, presented itself as rigorous scholarship while advancing theories that professional archaeologists and historians found deeply problematic. Donnelly's background as a populist politician rather than an academic scholar profoundly influenced his approach to the Atlantis question. Born in Philadelphia in 1831, he had built his career on challenging established authorities and championing the common man against entrenched elites. His political experience in Minnesota territorial politics and his 3 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives had honed his skills in persuasive rhetoric and popular communication. When he turned his attention to ancient history, he brought the same combative spirit and popular sensibilities that had characterized his political career, positioning himself as a truth-telling outsider challenging the dogmas of academic establishments. The intellectual climate of the 1880s provided fertile ground for Donnelly's revolutionary claims about human prehistory. Charles Darwin's Origin of Species had fundamentally altered scientific understanding of human development. while archaeological discoveries across Europe, Egypt, and the Americas were revealing evidence of sophisticated ancient civilizations that challenged traditional biblical chronologies. The general public, educated enough to follow scientific developments but lacking specialized knowledge to evaluate competing claims, proved remarkably receptive to bold new theories that promised to explain mysterious archaeological phenomena and ancient myths within comprehensive theoretical frameworks. Donnelly's central thesis rested on the proposition that Plato's Atlantis had been a real historical civilization whose destruction approximately 11,000 years ago had scattered survivors across the globe, carrying advanced knowledge and cultural practices that became the foundation for all subsequent human civilizations. This catastrophic dispersal, according to Donnelly, explained the remarkable similarities he claimed to observe between ancient cultures separated by vast geographical distances. Rather than viewing these similarities as evidence of independent human development or later cultural contact, Donnelly argued they represented the fragmentary preservation of a common Atlantean heritage. The methodological approach that Donnelly employed in constructing his argument combined selective citation of legitimate archaeological and ethnographic sources with speculative interpretations that extended far beyond what the evidence could reasonably support. He demonstrated remarkable industry in gathering comparative material from diverse cultures, citing everything from Aztec creation myths to Egyptian pyramid construction techniques to Celtic folklore. However, his analysis consistently emphasized superficial similarities while ignoring fundamental differences, and he showed little concern for the chronological context that would have been essential for establishing actual historical connections. Donnelly's treatment of flood myths provided a representative example of his methodology. He compiled extensive lists of flood narratives from cultures around the world, noting apparent similarities in their descriptions of worldwide catastrophes that destroyed earlier civilizations. From these parallels, he argued that all flood myths preserve distorted memories of the actual destruction of Atlantis, transmitted through oral traditions by scattered survivors. The linguistic evidence that Donnelly marshaled in support of his theories reflected both the strengths and weaknesses of 19th-century comparative philology. He identified numerous words from different language families that appeared to share common roots, arguing that these similarities demonstrated descent from a common Atlantean linguistic ancestor. Professional linguists recognized that Donnelly's methods could be used to prove virtually any desired linguistic relationship, making his conclusions essentially meaningless from a scholarly perspective. The architectural parallels that formed another pillar of Donnelly's argument drew on the growing body of archaeological knowledge about ancient construction techniques and monumental buildings. He noted that cultures as diverse as the ancient Egyptians, Mesoamerican civilizations, and various European megalithic builders had all constructed massive stone structures using sophisticated engineering techniques. These similarities, according to Donnelly, could only be explained by assuming that all these cultures had inherited their architectural knowledge from Atlantean colonists who had escaped the Great Catastrophe. Donnelly's analysis of pyramid construction proved particularly influential in establishing lasting Atlantis mythologies. He argued that the mathematical precision evident in Egyptian pyramids, combined with similar structures found in Mexico and other regions, demonstrated the global spread of advanced Atlantean knowledge. His calculations of pyramid dimensions and astronomical alignments, while often mathematically accurate, extended into speculative interpretations about encoded ancient wisdom that went far beyond what the archaeological evidence could support. The popular fascination with pyramid mysteries that his work helped establish would influence subsequent generations of alternative historians and conspiracy theorists. The impact of Donnelly's work on popular consciousness proved immediate and profound, transforming Atlantis from an obscure philosophical dialogue into a central reference point for discussions about human prehistory and lost civilizations. The book's commercial success was extraordinary for a work of scholarship, going through multiple editions and translations that brought Donnelly's theories to readers across Europe and America. The Victorian context that made Donnelly's theories particularly appealing reflected broader cultural anxieties and aspirations that characterized the late 19th century. The rapid pace of technological change and imperial expansion had created unprecedented awareness of human potential, while simultaneously raising questions about the permanence of civilizational achievements. Donnelly's narrative of a great civilization destroyed by natural catastrophe spoke to contemporary fears about the fragility of progress, while his emphasis on the global spread of Atlantean knowledge appealed to Victorian confidence in the civilizing mission of advanced cultures. The transformation of Atlantis from Donnelly's pseudo-archaeological construct into a cornerstone of modern occult doctrine began with Helena Petrovna Blavatsky's ambitious synthesis of Eastern philosophy, Western esotericism, and speculative anthropology in the 1880s. Blavatsky, a Russian aristocrat turned spiritual teacher, possessed an extraordinary talent for weaving together disparate religious and philosophical traditions into comprehensive cosmological systems that promised to reveal hidden truths about human spiritual evolution. Her monumental work, The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, elevated Atlantis from a lost civilization into a crucial stage in humanity's cosmic development, establishing interpretive frameworks that would influence esoteric thought for more than a century. Blavatsky's approach to Atlantis differed fundamentally from Donnelly's archaeological methodology, drawing instead on claimed access to ancient wisdom preserved in Tibetan monasteries and transmitted through psychic revelation. She asserted that her teachings derived from the Akashic records, a cosmic repository of all human experience accessible through advanced spiritual development, and from direct communication with Mahatmas, ascended masters who guided human evolution from hidden retreats in the Himalayas. This claimed supernatural authority allowed her to present detailed accounts of Atlantean civilization without relying on conventional historical evidence, positioning her revelations as superior to both academic scholarship and popular speculation. The doctrine of root races formed the theoretical foundation of Blavatsky's Atlantis teachings, providing a framework that connected individual spiritual development with cosmic evolutionary cycles. According to theosophical cosmology, humanity progressed through 7 distinct root races, each representing a different stage of physical and spiritual evolution occurring over millions of years. The 4th root race, known as the Atlanteans, had inhabited Earth during a period when the planet's geography, climate, and spiritual conditions differed dramatically from contemporary circumstances. These beings possessed physical and psychic capabilities that modern humans had largely lost, representing both an evolutionary peak and a cautionary example of spiritual failure. The Atlantean root race, as described in theosophical literature, encompassed several subraces that developed different characteristics and capabilities over millions of years. The earliest Atlanteans were giants possessing natural psychic powers, direct communion with spiritual hierarchies, and technological capabilities that operated through spiritual rather than mechanical principles. Their civilization reached heights of material and spiritual achievement that surpassed anything known to recorded history, with cities of crystalline beauty, flying vehicles powered by spiritual energy, and social systems based on direct psychic communication between individuals and governing councils. Blavatsky's description of Atlantean technology emphasized its integration with spiritual principles rather than mechanical engineering. The Atlanteans supposedly powered their vehicles and machinery through manipulation of subtle energies that modern science had not yet discovered, using crystals and sound vibrations to achieve effects that contemporary technology accomplished through crude mechanical means. Their architecture incorporated sacred geometry and harmonic principles that created buildings serving simultaneously as functional spaces and spiritual instruments, with temples that could amplify psychic abilities and facilitate communication with higher spiritual planes. The decline and destruction of Atlantean civilization provided Blavatsky with a powerful illustration of the consequences of spiritual degeneracy and the misuse of occult knowledge. As the root race progressed through its evolutionary cycle, later generations gradually lost their natural spiritual abilities while retaining dangerous technological capabilities. The integration of spiritual and material power that had characterized early Atlantean civilization gave way to the separation of these domains, with a priestly class hoarding occult knowledge while political leaders pursued material ambitions divorced from spiritual wisdom. The practice of black magic emerged during Atlantis' declining period as individuals and groups began using spiritual knowledge for selfish purposes rather than cosmic service. The same psychic abilities and energy manipulation techniques that had created Atlantean civilization's golden age became tools for personal aggrandizement and the domination of others. Secret societies developed within Atlantean society, preserving dangerous occult practices while corrupting the spiritual teachings that had originally guided the race's development. Edgar Cayce's psychic readings about Atlantis, delivered during trance states between 1923 and 1944, provided the most detailed and influential modern account of the lost civilization while establishing interpretive frameworks that would dominate New Age approaches to ancient mysteries. Cayce, a photographer from Kentucky with no formal education in history or archaeology, claimed to access information about past lives and historical events through psychic means while in an unconscious state. His 14,000 documented readings included over 700 references to Atlantis, creating a comprehensive narrative that combined theosophical concepts with distinctive American metaphysical traditions. The Atlantean civilization described in Cayce's readings spanned a period from approximately 200,000 to 10,000 BC, encompassing multiple technological and spiritual developments that occurred over vast time periods. According to these psychic revelations, Atlantis had experienced 3 major periods of destruction caused by the misuse of advanced technology, with the final cataclysm around 10,500 BC completely submerging the continent beneath the Atlantic Ocean. The survivors of these destructions had migrated to various parts of the world, carrying Atlantean knowledge and establishing the foundations for ancient Egyptian, Mayan, and other advanced civilizations. The technology attributed to Atlantis in Cayce's readings centered on the use of crystals for generating and focusing various forms of energy that could power vehicles, provide illumination, and facilitate long-distance communication. The great crystal that served as the primary power source for Atlantean civilization was described as a massive stone capable of concentrating solar and cosmic energies for practical applications. The misuse of this crystal technology by later generations, who turned it toward destructive purposes and personal aggrandizement, ultimately caused the geological instabilities that led to the continent's destruction. The reincarnation patterns described in Cayce's readings suggested that many souls who had lived in Atlantis were returning to incarnation during the 20th century, bringing both advanced capabilities and unresolved karmic patterns from their previous existence. These returning Atlantean souls were said to possess natural abilities in technology, healing, and spiritual development that could contribute to human progress. But they also carried tendencies toward the misuse of power and the pursuit of material goals that had characterized Atlantis' decline. The systematic application of modern scientific methodology to Atlantis claims began in earnest during the early 20th century as professional archaeology established rigorous standards for evidence evaluation and peer review processes that would fundamentally challenge the speculative theories that had flourished during the Victorian era. The development of stratigraphic excavation techniques, radiocarbon dating methods, and comparative archaeological analysis provided tools for investigating ancient civilizations with unprecedented precision, creating opportunities to test the various claims about Atlantean influence on known historical cultures, while simultaneously revealing the absence of evidence for any advanced Atlantic civilization during the periods proposed by different theorists. The archaeological investigation of Mediterranean Bronze Age civilizations during the first half of the 20th century produced discoveries that initially seemed to support some aspects of Atlantis theories, while ultimately demonstrating the dangers of superficial historical parallels. The excavation of Minoan palaces on Crete by Sir Arthur Evans, beginning in 1900, revealed a sophisticated civilization that had flourished during the 2nd millennium BC. Possessing advanced hydraulic engineering, elaborate artistic traditions, and extensive maritime trade networks that connected the Aegean world with Egypt, Anatolia, and the Western Mediterranean. Evans himself initially drew explicit parallels between Minoan Crete and Plato's Atlantis, noting similarities in their island locations, maritime orientations, advanced technologies, and sudden destruction. However, as archaeological investigation of Minoan civilization progressed and more sophisticated analytical methods were applied, the apparent parallels to Atlantis began to dissolve under closer scrutiny. The chronological framework established through pottery analysis and radiocarbon dating placed Minoan civilization firmly within the 2nd millennium BC, far removed from the 9500 BC date that Plato had specified for Atlantis. The development of underwater archaeology during the mid-20th century provided new opportunities to investigate claims about submerged Atlantean ruins, while simultaneously revealing the technical challenges and evidentiary standards necessary for legitimate marine archaeological research. Jacques Cousteau's pioneering work with underwater exploration equipment during the 1940s and 1950s demonstrated the feasibility of systematic archaeological investigation beneath the ocean surface. While the development of side-scan sonar and other remote sensing technologies made it possible to survey large areas of the ocean floor for potential archaeological sites. The systematic survey of the Atlantic Ocean floor conducted by various oceanographic institutions during the second half of the 20th century produced detailed bathymetric maps that revealed the actual topography of the regions where Atlantis had been proposed to have existed. These surveys demonstrated that the Atlantic Ocean floor consisted primarily of abyssal plains lying at depths of 3,000 to 4,000 meters below sea level. With no evidence of recently submerged continental land masses that could have supported large-scale civilization during the time periods suggested by various Atlantis theories. The geological analysis of Atlantic Ocean sediment cores provided additional evidence against the existence of any large landmass in the Atlantic during the periods when Atlantis was supposed to have existed. The sediment layers revealed a consistent pattern of deep ocean deposition extending back millions of years, with no indication of the dramatic geological changes that would have been necessary to submerge a continent-sized landmass within the last 12,000 years. The absence of terrestrial sediments, pollen, or other indicators of nearby land surfaces in the deep Atlantic contradicted claims about recently submerged civilizations. The 20th and 21st centuries witnessed an unprecedented proliferation of Atlantis theories as advances in underwater exploration, satellite imaging, and geological analysis provided new tools for investigating ancient mysteries while simultaneously inspiring fresh speculation about possible locations for Plato's lost civilization. The Mediterranean hypothesis gained renewed attention, as did theories placing Atlantis everywhere from Antarctica to the Caribbean, from the North Sea to the Black Sea. Each new proposal drew upon emerging scientific techniques and archaeological discoveries. Yet none produced conclusive evidence that could satisfy professional scholarly standards. Contemporary researchers continue to propose new Atlantis locations based on emerging archaeological discoveries and improved analytical techniques, demonstrating the enduring appeal of Plato's narrative as an explanatory framework for ancient mysteries. The methodology employed by contemporary Atlantis researchers reveals both the strengths and limitations of modern archaeological and geological techniques when applied to speculative historical claims. Advanced remote sensing technologies can identify potential archaeological sites over large areas and detect buried structures that would be impossible to locate through conventional survey methods. However, These same technologies also demonstrate the rarity of significant archaeological anomalies and the frequency with which apparent artificial features prove to be natural geological formations upon detailed investigation. The critical evaluation of modern Atlantis theories requires careful attention to the distinction between legitimate archaeological questions and speculative historical claims that extend beyond available evidence. While many proposed Atlantis locations correspond to genuine archaeological sites that merit professional investigation, the interpretation of these sites as remnants of Plato's specific lost civilization typically involves assumptions and connections that cannot be supported through rigorous analysis. The tendency to identify superficial similarities between different ancient cultures as evidence of common Atlantean origin reflects the same methodological problems that characterized Donnelly's Victorian-era speculation, despite the availability of more sophisticated analytical tools. The transformation of Plato's philosophical allegory into a global cultural phenomenon reveals fundamental aspects of human psychology that transcend historical periods, technological capabilities, and cultural boundaries. The persistent appeal of Atlantis across more than 2 millennia demonstrates how certain narrative structures satisfy deep-seated psychological needs while adapting to changing social circumstances and intellectual frameworks. Understanding why Atlantis continues to captivate modern audiences requires examining the psychological mechanisms that make lost civilization narratives compelling, the ways these stories reflect contemporary anxieties and aspirations, and their relationship to broader patterns of alternative historical thinking that challenge established academic authority. The archetypal structure of the Atlantis narrative taps into universal psychological patterns that Carl Jung identified as fundamental components of human consciousness. The story of a golden age followed by moral decline and catastrophic destruction resonates with mythological themes found across cultures, from the Garden of Eden to the Hindu concept of cyclical yugas. These narratives provide frameworks for understanding both individual and collective experiences of loss, failure, and the consequences of moral choices. The psychological appeal of lost wisdom represents another crucial factor in Atlantis's enduring popularity. Modern individuals, overwhelmed by rapid technological change and the fragmentation of knowledge into increasingly specialized disciplines, find comfort in narratives that promise comprehensive understanding and integrated wisdom. The idea that an ancient civilization possessed complete knowledge of natural laws, spiritual principles, and technological applications offers hope that such integration remains possible despite contemporary intellectual fragmentation. The democratization of knowledge through internet technologies has created unprecedented opportunities for individuals to develop and promote alternative historical theories without traditional academic credentials or institutional support. Online communities dedicated to Atlantis research can share information, coordinate investigations, and develop elaborate theoretical frameworks that operate independently of professional archaeological consensus. These communities often exhibit characteristics of what Richard Hofstadter identified as the paranoid style in politics, interpreting academic skepticism toward their theories as evidence of deliberate suppression rather than methodological rigor. Contemporary environmental anxieties have profoundly influenced modern interpretations of the Atlantis narrative, transforming it from a story about political and moral corruption into a cautionary tale about technological hubris and ecological destruction. Climate change, ocean pollution, and biodiversity loss provide contemporary parallels to the catastrophic destruction that supposedly ended Atlantean civilization, making Plato's ancient account seem prophetically relevant to current global challenges. The commercialization of Atlantis themes through tourism, entertainment, and alternative education markets has created economic incentives for promoting speculative theories regardless of their scholarly merit. Tourist destinations claiming connections to Atlantean civilization, documentary programs featuring dramatic recreations of the lost continent, and books promising to reveal ancient secrets all benefit financially from maintaining public interest in alternative historical narratives. These commercial pressures often encourage increasingly sensational claims and elaborate conspiracy theories that can capture public attention in competitive entertainment markets. The enduring legacy of Plato's Atlantis ultimately transcends questions about its historical accuracy to encompass fundamental issues about human nature, social organization, and the relationship between material progress and moral development. Whether interpreted as philosophical allegory, historical account, or modern mythology, the Atlantis narrative continues to provide frameworks for exploring these eternal questions while adapting to contemporary circumstances and concerns. The phenomenon of Atlantis reveals both the strengths and limitations of human pattern-seeking behavior, showing how the same cognitive processes that enable scientific discovery and cultural innovation can also generate elaborate misconceptions and resistant belief systems. Understanding why Atlantis persists in human imagination requires acknowledging both its positive functions as a source of wonder, inspiration, and community, and its problematic aspects as a vehicle for pseudoscientific thinking and conspiracy theories. As humanity faces unprecedented global challenges requiring both technological innovation and wisdom about the consequences of our choices, the Atlantis story remains relevant as a cautionary tale about the relationship between power and responsibility. Whether the lost civilization existed as Plato described, served as metaphor for political corruption, or functions as modern mythology about human potential, its central message about the dangers of moral decline and the fragility of civilizational achievement speaks directly to contemporary concerns about sustainability, justice, and the future of human civilization. In the end, Atlantis endures not because we have found it, but because we continue searching. The story survives because it asks questions that every generation must answer for itself. What makes a civilization great? What causes it to fall? Can we recognize our own decline before it becomes irreversible? And in our pursuit of power and prosperity, do we risk losing the very virtues that made our achievements possible? These are not questions that archaeology can answer. They are questions of philosophy, of ethics, of the human condition itself. And perhaps that was Plato's intention all along. Not to record a forgotten history, but to create a mirror in which every civilization could see its own reflection and recognize both its potential for greatness and its capacity for self-destruction. In this light, the greatest mystery of Atlantis is not where it was or whether it existed, but why, after more than 2,000 years, we still cannot look away.